Picture this. It's March 1941. Britain is on its knees, slowly starving. Not from a blockade of warships, but from an invisible enemy lurking beneath the waves. Every single day, 5 more merchant ships, laden with food, fuel and weapons, disappear into the cold, dark Atlantic. They're the victims of German U-boats, the steel sharks of the Kriegsmarine, commanded by the brilliant and ruthless Admiral Karl Dönitz. Dönitz, New Britain's Achilles heel. It was an island nation utterly dependent on the sea. To survive, Britain needed to import a staggering 43 million tons of supplies every single year. That's everything from the grain for their daily bread to the oil for their Spitfires, and Donitz's U-boats were systematically severing that lifeline. The numbers were terrifying. In the first 3 months of 1941, U-boats sank 350,000 tons of Allied shipping. That's like sending the entire Titanic to the bottom. 23 times over, and it was getting worse. In April alone, the losses skyrocketed past 500,000 tons. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, a man who stared down the Blitz without flinching, later confessed that the U-boat menace was the only thing during the war that truly, genuinely frightened him. He knew that if the supply lines were cut, the war was lost. No army, no matter how brave, can fight on an empty stomach. So how were the Germans doing it? How were they achieving this devastating success? The answer lies in a tactic as cunning as it was deadly. The Wolfpack Dönitz didn't send his E-boats out alone. He organized them into hunting parties, groups of 8, 12, sometimes even more submarines that would patrol the vast expanses of the Atlantic. When one U-boat spotted a convoy, it wouldn't attack right away. Instead, it would shadow the ships, radioing their position, speed, and heading back to headquarters. Dönitz, from his command center hundreds of miles away in France, would then gather the pack. Under the cover of darkness, the wolves would close in. They'd attack on the surface at night, where their low silhouettes made them almost impossible to spot against the black water. They would race in, fire their torpedoes, and then slip away into the chaos before the convoy's escorts even knew what hit them. The British escort ships, mostly older, slower destroyers, were completely overwhelmed. There were simply not enough of them to protect the massive convoys that snaked across the ocean. Imagine trying to guard a flock of 50 sheep from a dozen hungry wolves with just 2 or 3 sheepdogs. It was a losing battle. The British were caught in a horrifying cycle of loss. Their shipyards were working around the clock, but they couldn't build ships fast enough. For every 120 new merchant vessels they managed to launch in a 3-month period, the U-boats would sink that same number in just 6 weeks. It was a race against time. They were desperately losing, and it wasn't just the ships, it was the men. With every sinking, experienced merchant seamen, the unsung heroes of this battle were lost. These were skills that couldn't be replaced overnight. The loss of specific cargoes was catastrophic. A tanker full of aviation fuel meant fewer fighters in the sky. A ship carrying munitions meant less ammunition for the soldiers at the front. And a ship full of food meant tighter rationing back home, dwindling morale, and a population growing weaker by the day. The very ability of Britain to wage war was being choked off, torpedo by torpedo. Dönitz, meanwhile, was in a position of strength. He had around 60 operational U-boats at sea at any given time, with another 30 in training, ready to join the hunt. The Royal Navy was stretched to its absolute limit, fighting on all fronts from the Mediterranean to the North Sea. They needed a solution, and they needed it fast. They needed a new type of escort vessel, one that could be built quickly, cheaply, and in huge numbers. A dedicated submarine hunter. The answer didn't come from the grand naval design offices or the established warship manufacturers. It came from a much more unexpected place, the icy waters off the coast of Iceland. It came from the humble whale catcher. These were small, rugged no-frills ships built for one purpose: to endure the brutal conditions of the North Atlantic and hunt massive prey. They weren't fast, but they were tough and reliable. Someone in the Admiralty had a flash of genius. What if they could adapt this simple, proven design for war? The idea took hold. Approved in 1939, just as the war was beginning, this new class of ship would become a legend. They weren't glamorous. They weren't powerful destroyers or mighty battleships. They were small, they were slow, and they were named after flowers. They were the flower-class corvettes. These ships were the embodiment of good enough. They were about 62 meters long, displacing just 950 tons. Their simple steam engine could push them to a top speed of only 16 knots, barely faster than a submerged U-boat. But speed wasn't the point. Endurance was. They were designed to stay at sea for long periods, plodding along with the slow-moving convoys. They were built in small, civilian shipyards all across Britain and Canada, places that had never built a warship before. This was their greatest strength. Because they were so simple, they could be constructed in as little as 5 or 6 months. A fraction of the time and cost it took to build a destroyer. This meant they could be mass-produced, flooding the Atlantic with the escorts the convoys so desperately needed. Their armament was basic: a single 4-inch gun on the bow, a few machine guns for anti-aircraft defense, and their most important weapon, the depth charge. Each corvette carried a payload of between 40 and 70 of these underwater bombs. Their job wasn't necessarily to outfight the U-boats, but to make their lives a living hell, to force them to stay submerged, to harry them, to break up their wolf-pack attacks, and to give the merchant ships a fighting chance to get through. These little ships, nicknamed the Cheap and Nasties by the sailors who served on them, were about to sail into the heart of the storm. They were wet, they rolled violently in the Atlantic swells, and life aboard was incredibly cramped and uncomfortable. But they were the stopgap measure, the desperate gamble that Britain needed. The Flower-class corvette was the unlikely hero that would step into the ring and take on Dönitz's Wolfpacks in the longest, most critical battle of the Second World War, the Battle of the Atlantic. The fate of Britain, and perhaps the entire war, would rest on the rusted decks of these tiny, flower-named warships. Have you ever heard of the Flower-class corvette? If you picture the naval battles of World War II, you probably imagine massive battleships, sleek aircraft carriers, or powerful destroyers. But the real turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous military campaign of the war, wasn't decided by these giants. It was won by a tiny, unassuming, and frankly miserable little ship, the Flower-class corvette. And today we're going to tell their incredible story. In the early days of the war, Britain was fighting for its life. It's an island nation, completely dependent on imports of food, fuel, and war materials brought in by convoys of merchant ships. Germany knew this, and their U-boats, the infamous wolf packs, were sinking these ships at an alarming rate. The Royal Navy had a problem. Their best anti-submarine warships were destroyers. These were fast, heavily armed, and effective. But there was a catch. They were also incredibly expensive, consumed huge amounts of fuel, and most importantly, there just weren't enough of them. The disasters of 1940, like the Dunkirk evacuation and the Norwegian campaign, had taken a heavy toll. 23 destroyers were lost and another 37 damaged. These ships were too valuable to be tied up on the slow, grinding work of escorting merchant convoys across the treacherous North Atlantic. They were needed to screen the main battle fleet, to hunt for German surface raiders, and to protect against invasion. So, if the destroyers couldn't do the job, who could? The answer came from an unlikely source, a design based on a whale-catching ship. The Flower-class corvette was born out of desperation. It was small, cheap to build, and could be mass-produced in civilian shipyards that weren't equipped to build complex warships. This meant they could be built in huge numbers, and numbers were exactly what was needed to provide proper end-to-end escorts for the convoys. But let's be clear, living on one of these ships was absolute misery. They were notoriously cramped. Men were packed into tiny, damp spaces. They rolled violently in the Atlantic swells, earning them the nickname the Rolling Forties because they were said to roll on wet grass. In a storm, everything not bolted down would fly across the deck. Men would be thrown from their bunks. Simple tasks like eating a meal became a monumental challenge. The constant motion-induced seasickness that could incapacitate even veteran sailors. The living conditions were, to put it mildly, abysmal. But these little ships had a secret weapon. They were survivors. The North Atlantic is one of the most hostile marine environments on Earth. Brutal storms can whip up monstrous waves that can break larger ships in two. Destroyers, with their long, sleek hulls, were surprisingly vulnerable. The immense stress of plunging through massive waves could cause their frames to bend and buckle, a phenomenon known as hogging and sagging. In the worst storms even, these powerful warships were often forced to run for shelter, leaving the convoys they were supposed to protect defenseless. But the little corvettes, with their short, stubby hulls, just bounced around like corks. They were hideously uncomfortable, but they were tough. They could endure weather that sent much larger vessels running. Their simple, robust construction meant they could take a pounding and keep on fighting. This endurance was their first great advantage. It meant they could stick with the convoy no matter what the Atlantic threw at them. And that's where their second advantage came into play. The primary tool for hunting a submerged U-boat was ASDIC, what we now call sonar. It worked by sending out a ping of sound through the water. If that ping hit the metal hull of a submarine, it would bounce back as an echo, revealing the sub's bearing and range. But ASDIC had a weakness. It didn't work well in rough seas. The noise of waves crashing against the hull and the ship's own pitching and rolling could drown out the faint echo of a distant submarine on a destroyer, which would often have to slow down or change course in a storm. ASDIC performance dropped dramatically, but on the corvettes it was a different story, because of their unique seakeeping qualities. Their ASDIC sets remained surprisingly effective, even in very rough water. This was a game changer. It meant that a corvette could continue to hunt a U-boat in conditions where a destroyer couldn't. They could maintain contact, track the enemy, and attack when other ships were blind. Imagine the scene. You're a crewman on a 4-hour watch, standing on the open bridge of a corvette in the middle of a winter storm. The temperature is below freezing. Icy spray is constantly lashing over the ship, freezing solid on every surface. Your hands are numb, your face is raw from the wind, and you're soaked to the bone. You're fighting off frostbite, hypothermia, and sheer exhaustion. But you stay at your post, the ASDIC operator below decks, listening intently through his headphones, for that faint, telltale ping is depending on you. The entire convoy is depending on you. When that echo finally came, the hunt was on. The ASDIC could detect a submarine up to 2,500 meters away. The corvette would then maneuver to attack with its primary weapon, the depth charge. These were essentially large drums filled with explosives set to detonate at a specific depth. When one exploded close enough to a U-boat, the shockwave would travel through the water and crush its pressure hull. Getting that placement right was the hard part. Early tactics were often ineffective. A single ship would race over the submarine's last known position and drop a pattern of charges. The problem was, as the ship sped up for the attack run, the noise of its own propellers would drown out the ASDIC. The crew would lose contact just before dropping the charges, essentially attacking blind. The U-boat commander, hearing the fast-approaching propeller noise, would often have just enough time to make a sharp turn and escape the blast. The solution, introduced in 1941, was a tactic called the creeping attack. It required 2 ships. One corvette, the directing ship, would stand off at a distance, using its ASDIC to maintain constant, uninterrupted contact with the submarine. It would then guide the second corvette, the attacking ship, slowly and quietly over the target's position. Because the attacking ship moved so slowly, the U-boat wouldn't hear it coming until it was too late. This two-ship method dramatically increased the kill rate. The wolf packs were no longer hunting with impunity. They were being hunted back. Then, in 1942, a new weapon arrived that completely revolutionized anti-submarine warfare, the Hedgehog. Unlike depth charges, which were dropped off the stern and exploded at a preset depth, the Hedgehog was a forward-firing weapon. It launched a pattern of 24 small, contact-fused projectiles ahead of the ship. This was a massive leap forward. Now, a corvette could keep its ASDIC locked onto the submarine throughout the entire attack run. There was no more blind spot. The projectiles only exploded if they physically hit the submarine. This meant there was no ambiguity. A series of underwater explosions was clear confirmation of a direct hit. By 1943, corvettes equipped with the Hedgehog were achieving kill rates of over 40% on their attacks. The tide was truly turning. We can see how these evolving tactics and technologies came together in the story of HMS Gladiolus. On October 17, 1941, Gladiolus was escorting convoy SC-48 through the Mid. The U-boat wolf packs were gathering for a major assault. An Aztec operator named Thomas Peake detected the telltale echo of a submarine stalking the convoy. It was U-553. 4 hours Gladiolus and another corvette, HMS Veronica, hunted the U-boat, using the new creeping attack tactic. They patiently tracked it, coordinated their movements, and finally delivered a precise depth charge attack. The resulting explosion brought wreckage and oil to the surface, confirming their kill. It was one of the first significant victories for the corvette escorts. This single engagement was a microcosm of the larger battle. It wasn't a glamorous fight. It was a long, slow, grinding war of attrition fought by ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances. It was a battle of endurance, of technology, and of tactics. And it was led not by the grand capital ships of the fleet, but by the hundreds of small, stubborn, and utterly indispensable flower-class corvettes. They were uncomfortable, they were wet, and they were miserable, but they refused to leave their convoys to the wolves. They held the line, and in doing so, they saved Britain and ensured the eventual Allied victory. Theirs is a story of grit and resilience that deserves to be remembered. Thank